It's time for us to begin this evening. If you want to go ahead and get settled in, we're going to be doing a couple of things tonight as part of our evening Bible study allotted time. We are going to be going over a very brief overview of the history of Israel. We're going to do that in combination with a visual show and tell. A couple of folks have really been wanting to see some of the photos from when I was in Israel in May, and so I've tried to group them together in a way that highlights some of the things we've talked about over the last maybe 2 years in our survey classes of the Old Testament, specifically 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, and kind of tying together some of the major bits of that story in a way that shouldn't be boring. I'm going to try to avoid the go over to somebody's house and watch 4,000 slides of their recent trip to the beach approach. Before we get into the class itself, though, I do want to make sure that I'm going to let everyone get settled. We've got another group of folks coming in. Just a couple quick reminders. This is a class, and that means you get to ask any questions you would like, whomever you are. If you've got a question about what you see on the overhead or in the material that we've studied before, please ask your questions. It's totally fine. Secondly, our focus is not on modern geopolitical concerns. Our focus is on how does this interact with the biblical text? What does this tell us about God's people and about how that land had an effect on the way the story is told for us? With that, let's begin our class with prayer, and if you would, at this time, bow with me for that prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for the time we shared together in prayer. We thank you for your word and its message to us. Help us to be good listeners, help us to be good students, and help us to invest our hearts into your word and your will and to build our faith. This is our prayer in your Son's name. Amen. Hey, Jesse, could you get that door for me so that, since you can get it one more time? I got it a couple of times already. All right, so what we've got to kind of connect with in all of this is a couple of quick details. We're going to start, we'll see this picture again. I'll describe the details in a moment. We're going to start by stepping off of the pictures and maybe even the page of our Bibles for a second and kind of pay attention to a quick look at how we might normally think about history. A lot of times in our Bible class, I make the point that the biblical texts don't tell history the way that our history classes do, because they're actually not history texts. They're not a history school book. They're actually theologically inclined. That is, they are intentionally written to persuade you about the nature of God, about the history of God's people. And so there is an intent obvious in many of those books that we kind of pay attention to. Well, this is an approximation of how we can kind of group together the history of Israel using terms that might be more familiar to those to history classes. And very quickly and very briefly, you'll note that I've got some familiar terms. Creation, you'll note that I have no actual time specified for that. That's because the Bible actually doesn't say a time. It actually just says one qualifier for us, in the beginning. And we get in a lot of trouble when we try to define when the beginning was the beginning. And so the biblical text, in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1, John 1:1. Great passages to help you kind of say that's what it is. Are there all kinds of theories? Yes, but not within the context of the biblical text. And so the best way to group it in a categorization is say that's the beginning. It's creation just as recorded, and then move forward from that and think about all the rest of the stuff. There's a lot of events in what we would call the patriarchs, the patriarchal period, that take place in the time frame after creation and before the last parts of what archaeologists refer to broadly as the Bronze Age, for lots of reasons. And there's different little chunks of Bronze Age. So as a side note, on this chart, where you see like Bronze Age, Iron Age, note that they break those out into smaller groups. There's usually in groups of 3. And so there's like age 1, 2, and 3 inside each of those. As a nation, We're talking about Saul forward. That's really where things start to have a larger amount of physical archaeological evidence for us to think about. It's very difficult to talk about the captivity periods. It's very difficult to talk about large details with some of the things that happen prior to that captivity with certainty. Like we know what happened on this year, this day, because there's a lot of variability there. But roughly, what you can see here, if you take Israel as our centerpiece on your map and you think about Israel here, you can say, well, what kind of kings were going on in kingdoms south of them? You had Egypt, then that was sublimated by Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, and Greek and Roman. North of them, you've got a smattering of kingdoms, miscellaneous kingdoms north of them for most of the Bronze Age. And then, because of the dominance of Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then Rome, they too then start to be the dominant things around Israel. And so if you're trying to place them in history, now you've got some boundaries. You know that north and south of the Canaanite or Israelite region, these are the kingdoms everyone talks about. And then internal, in our yellow color here, this roughly translates to approximately the course of Israel in that. Slaves in Egypt, a united and then divided kingdom, a series of 3 clumps of Israel go into captivity. 3 clumps go in. And then in the later part of the Persian period, 3 clumps come out of that captivity to rebuild Israel. But at that point, post-captivity, they are never truly a free people ever again. They are always considered what is called a vassal state. That is, they have a certain level of independence in the various empires that have dominance, but they have to pay their taxes. And their taxes are money, stuff, and people, labor, to do whatever. And so when a king like Herod wants to build something, he can just go out and make people do it. That's the way taxation effectively functioned in the slave state status of nearly this entire period, where slaves are kind of this part of the commodity system and treated like things, not people, by all these groups. So that's big history stuff. That's like kind of boring, but kind of not boring at the same time, depending on your interest level in the subject. Before we get into the second part of our conversation tonight, any questions about this? Is this new to any of you, or have you seen something like this before? Are you awake, and did you have enough coffee this afternoon? Those are also valid questions. All right, so just a quick overview of it. Not highly detailed, but big picture. All right, let's see. So we're going to go through this for my sake and maybe yours in a brief way to talk about 10 days. But in those 10 days, we're going to highlight places, people, and things that are relevant to the Bible story. This is, anyone know what this is called? Dome of the Rock, right? 2 things you need to know about this. One, it's located approximately at the site of what would have been the second rebuilt temple. It's about where it might have been, although it's hard to know exactly because that entire area was scraped clean, and they kind of think that's what this is. Secondly, this is also important for those who are interested in history and the way Christianity spread throughout the Middle Eastern region afterwards. The style and design of the Dome of the Rock is not uniquely Islamic or Muslim. It is actually a copy of a Coptic church design that was common in the area. So this shape of a place of worship predates all of the Muslim mosques built in this style. It's just interesting to note that Egyptian, that's Coptic Christians, are the ones who kind of made this style of church building popular. And it's really the standard mosque. But if you go into Egypt, it's the standard church building shape. There's this kind of look from that era. And this thing was built there around the 7th century AD. And so you kind of think about 700 years after the events of our primary concern is when this gets built there. Where it's located, though, you see this large door that's opened up there, and then to the right of it, you see this kind of like covered porch-looking space right there. This kind of helps us visualize an event that takes place in the Bible. In particular, the western edge of this, which is what's shown right there, is kind of where Solomon's porch was located. So in the same area, in Acts chapter 3, is where you would have had a lot of gospel preaching. In this location, there's still the sections of it referred to as a retaining wall, but you know it's through news in a different name. There's a wall in that area that has a second name. Who knows what that name is? The Wailing Wall, right? That's not because they're fishing there for whales. It's a different kind of whaling. It's a place where prayer takes place amongst some of the Jewish population. Not all Jews go to the edge of the temple retaining wall space to offer their prayers and to place a little piece of paper in there. But some do, and this is a photo from that on the men's side. It's split by gender, and so all you have, though, is them standing at a spot where the temple was near. This retaining wall was built during the expansion of Herod's time, and it's all that's really accessible from the Jewish side of the occupied area around the temple, and so this is all they have. And so from that space, they can go there and they can do some archaeology and some research, but they can't go any further because the rest of it's all defiled. It's unclean, and it's all off limits because it's in a controlled, occupied zone. And so, of note for this picture that's interesting, what he has on his head is a little box, and he places scripture in there as an effort to accomplish some of the things that were practiced in the first century as well, where they were trying to bind the scriptures on their foreheads like frontlets. They've literalized that passage, and so they put various scriptures up there, and that's what's going on there. Gentleman here is dressed in a way that indicates he's most likely Hasidic. That means he's part of a communal aspect of Judaism in that they are tied together to their family groups. And so all Hasidic Jews, you meet anywhere, they have a family bond that goes up to a high-level patriarch in their family who kind of makes all their decisions. And there's some unique things about them we can talk about in private if you want to know more about Hasidic Jews. Outside of this area is something that's important for us from our biblical studies. This is a view that goes out into the Valley of David. The Valley of David is interesting. We'll look at this in a second. There's some great archaeological work that's been done exhuming the remains of what they think is part of David's palace. They used to think it was part of his throne. Now they just call it the large stone structure because it was actually most likely one of the most common buildings in antiquity, a storehouse. Most old buildings you find in archaeology are things to hold things. That's like 90% of their structures. Storeroom, storeroom, storeroom. So our purpose, though, is to think about this from the standpoint of David. We read about it a couple times recently and talked about it a lot. When he was supposed to be out at war, he was back at home in his palace, overlooking the city of David. And from his palace, what did he look out and see? Bathsheba. Now, have you ever wondered what was going on there in regards to his ability to see what was taking place? Because you think that first century homes were all like really low, flat places and there's no elevation change. Well, his place is up on one of the highest places in Jerusalem. Bathsheba's place would have been down in the Valley of David. So anywhere on top of his roof, he would have seen all the homes. And that kind of helps you get the visualization of what takes place in the text. And that he can look down and see all of that, whatever was going on, whomever was there. And he's doing it with his own eyes. So it's not so much that he could see her, it's that he knew that she was there. He had already seen her in the court because that's where she had grown up. She came from a family of power herself. And so it kind of helps us shape that story a little bit and move it off of maybe how we thought it was to read it more in the context of, hey, this makes sense. All of this is kind of normal. Here's that structure. This is the large stone structure, sometimes referred to as parts of David's palace. You can see that it is a stack of rocks. I want to go ahead and forewarn you that you're going to see lots of stacks of rocks because two things are true about what's in Israel. When they exhume something from the ground and do the archaeological research, they find a bunch of rocks. And all the rocks are the same color. The only thing that makes it different is every single one of these archaeology sites is full of broken pottery. That's actually how they determine when. The pottery helps them date the things far more clearly than the rocks. And the pottery there is in massive abundance. Broken pottery is just everywhere. In fact, at some of the sites, it's so abundant that you can just reach down, put your hand through the dirt, and pick up a handful of ancient pottery, 1,000-year-old bits and pieces of pottery, and nobody cares. And nobody cares when you take it on your plane and bring it back home. Now, if you're in the Israel side, they absolutely care. But if you're in the Palestinian side, nobody cares. There's so much of it there that it's just not a thing. Also, you may have read in your Bibles at some point about the building of a tunnel to allow water to go into David's palace. This is that tunnel. Does it look big to you? Let me just tell you it's not. Les, you would have to lean over in there. Like, it's not tall at all. It's got about 6 to 12 inches of water in the bottom of it, constantly flowing. That's cold, clear water. And it is, for visualization's sake, it's probably about this wide. So you can turn on your side, and a person might be able to get through. But otherwise, it's a small carved spot of the rock that terminates in the Pool of Siloam, which you can read about in John chapter 9. A couple Bible events take place there, but the Pool of Siloam now looks like a bunch of rocks with a little bit of water trickling out. Nothing special to it. But this is that actual tunnel mentioned in the biblical text and how they provide water for it. And yeah, it's kind of tight in there. Back up on top of the temple, thought I'd note this real quick. This right here is the bare rock of the temple space. This is actually the only area up there that's uncovered. And the whole top of it, underneath all the tiles you typically see, those are all tiles. That's all new. This right here is the only piece where you can see and say this is first century depth. And so a little rock space there. Outside all of this, this is the archaeological part that surrounds the area of the Temple Mount. If you're standing right here like we are, and you take your hand to your left, you're pointing at the Wailing Wall. All right? If you look at the bottom part of this little spot right here, this little bump out is actually the remains of the beginning of a large arch. That arch would have covered or allowed stairs to walk up there, a stairwell to get all the way up to the top. There are 2 stairwells on that side. This one, which is long gone, and the other one, which is the entrance into the dung gate, which just meant that was animals on the bottom end of it at one point or another, are the ways in which a lot of folks would travel into the Temple Mount area during the time of Jesus. Underneath it is a market space from the first century. And so if you wanted to go buy things of any kind, they were all sold in these little stalls down there and down below. So that's one day in Israel with a lot of little quick things. Each day will get shorter as we go along, so we've got a little bit less detail. Again, if you've got questions, you absolutely have to raise your hand and ask them, because I've got a Rolodex in my brain that's going, and it's going at his pace, and I do have questions at times too. Right now what you see here is Masada. Masada is important to us not because of the events that took place at the end of the Second Temple period, but because it represents that cultural time. At the time of Jesus, when Jesus arrived, there was a number of comments made by the leading Jews regarding other false messiahs, right? You guys remember reading that at different times in your Bible? What was the general consensus from the leading Jews about these zealots who would claim to be the new Messiah? Remember what some of the things they said about them were? They were false. These guys eventually petered out. A lot of them were tried as criminals. Some of them took a few off into the wilderness. Well, Masada is actually located. You have to go up all the mountainsides and then down deep into the valley that heads towards Jericho to get to Masada. And it is actually the site of the last holdouts of the Israelite forces who were rebelling against Rome at the close of the Second Temple period. So it's like the last rebels. And they were crushed, just wrecked. No good came of that. This is up on the top of that, though. This sees part of the remains of the palace space, because Masada was built by one of the Herods as a reserve fortress. They exhumed a lot of the remnants from there, and they found a number of sling and cannonballs. Not cannonballs, catapult balls. I say cannonballs because they look like. But those are, the small ones are about the size of a baseball. Those are sling stones. The larger ones would have been used in various types of siege equipment by the Roman Empire in their attempt to take down the city. The reality was they were completely and consistently unsuccessful in besieging Masada until they brought in a bunch of Jews from Jerusalem to build a massive siege ramp, because they knew that the Jews up on top wouldn't kill their own countrymen. And then once they got to the top, they found out, according to history and the antiquities of Josephus, everyone was dead, except for just 2 people that told the story. A lot of question over the reality of that, if that actually took place that way, but that's the history that has been relayed to us. But that also tells you about the dedication of the people of this generation. This is the last generations of the Jews, zealots like Simon, who are willing to die for their beliefs that they should be free from Rome. So Masada kind of codifies this. This space here is actually more important than Masada. What do you see here, though? Describe it in your own terms, this picture. And if you know what it is, you can't answer. That means you. It's a bunch of rocks, right? What's in those rocks? There's a whole bunch of caves in there, and they're not really great caves. They're actually built, the rocks that they were carved into are not very stable. You can kind of see here on this section where the erosion is constantly peeling those caves away, because it's not a really strong, durable substance. These are the caves that surround the Qumran community that have produced for us a wealth of understanding in regards to religious practice and how to read the Hebrew Bible and how to understand religious practice of the first century. The Qumran community that existed here prior to the fall of Masada and the end of the Roman Empire, or Jerusalem's place in the Roman Empire, as they were about to be overrun by Rome, they took all of their literature, all their writings, which is almost exclusively 2 things, and they hid it in these caves. What they hid there were copies of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, in Hebrew, and their religious rule books, how they functioned as a community religiously. It's from those that we actually have a great ability to understand and recognize the Hebrew writings, and anything that you've read that's been written after 1960 about the Bible has been influenced by those caves. 100%, that's like the most significant find for interpretation, but it also provided textual witness for a majority of the Old Testament. That is, at the time that these things took place, they had a large portion of what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible in their community, and they were reading from it regularly. There's only, I think, 2 books that have no record of it being in that community that are in our Bible, but that's probably any number of reasons for that to be the case. There's let's say the 100% of stuff they've pulled out of those caves, they've only actually examined about 1% of those records. So there's a lot we still don't even know about what they had there. But they actually also had things like the entire book of Isaiah was found in a couple sections there in these caves. This cave is interesting in particular because it was obviously found by Roman soldiers who came in there to occupy and push these people out. We know that for two reasons. Reason number one is all the pottery vessels that were holding their writings were destroyed, broken every single one of them, and they left graffiti. Roman graffiti is super common for their military. Once they go somewhere, they mark it up and tag it up. If you talk about anybody who served in the military, you get bored in a foxhole long enough, you start carving stuff in the sides of the walls. And so it's a very common historical thing for folks serving in the military to do, and they did it there too. And so it's just unique to this particular cave here that you can see from the side of the site, had that all there. This looks out to the Dead Sea. So that has us at Masada and looking at a lot of the cool stuff from the Bible there. What time is it, Michael? How fast am I going? All right, I got 20 minutes. We're good. I had to pull my watch out. That means I got 20 minutes. I got to speed up. Who's that guy? No, it's me, right? And Elvis. There's a gas station located, what's of interest for us, right next to Shiloh, right next to a couple of the places where the ark stood when it wasn't with Israel. And so where the Ark of the King of Kings hung out, there was also the King of Rock and Roll. And like a lot of things in Israel, you find folks who love certain aspects of American community. We'll see another one later. And they've just imported it. And so that entire gas station is super Elvis all the time. Everything you can think of is there. But also next to it is a visage of one of the spots near there. It is a site called Nebi Samuel, which means the tomb of Samuel. It's not actually the tomb of Samuel, but that's kind of how they refer to it. But from that vantage point, you can see cities like Jerusalem. You can see a number of Canaanite sites. You can see the Jordan Valley. There's a number of markers here. If you want to have a copy of this, I'm going to place all of this in a small file that you can download on the website to see all these pictures closer. But that spot is near to a place called Tel Gezer. Tel Gezer is one of the various cities built in the Canaanite period that were then taken over by the Israelites. We read about it in 1 Kings 9 and 1 Kings 10 as an Egyptian trade site. It's a city, which you can kind of see in this photo, looks like a lump of just dirt stacked on top of each other. It's every place in Israel also has that same look. But it's about 32 acres. But inside that, there are 26 layers of distinct occupation. So that means 26 times it was occupied, destroyed, and rebuilt over the course of 1,500 or so years. Over here, this site here is super interesting because this is the Valley of Elah. Anyone know what took place at the Valley of Elah? That's right. It's a place where David and Goliath had their epic word battle. And Goliath is like, I can crush all you horrible Israelites. Your God is nothing. And tormented the Philistines up on that ridge for a long time until David came. And with our VBS knowledge, what did David need? 3 smooth stones, right? But what did he actually need? God. And is it unreasonable to think that someone who had been a shepherd all of his life and a lot of time out in the wilderness might have gotten some aptitude with using a sling? You ever seen those kids who could take a pencil and like spin it on their fingers like it's some sort of mystical item and it just flies? You have now found a kid who has excelled at procrastinating from writing his homework because they practice that instead. They learned that. And that's a way to think about David out in the wild. He's learned how to throw a sling. It's also practical because he already talks about how he was able to successfully defend the flock. So this is the actual stream bed right here where the road is that he would have had to have walked across to go meet the army. And so if you're thinking, where did he get his stones? This is the likely spot for those stones to take place. We went back to Jerusalem for our next little endeavor. This is day 4, and we're going to go back to a spot of biblical significance known as the Mount of Olives, or the or Mount Olivet. These are old olive trees. Some have suggested, and I heard the first time I was there, that these are multi-thousand-year-old olive trees from the time of Christ. Olive trees can't actually live that long, but these are about as old as you can find in Israel. And they don't actually know how old they are, because in order to find out how old these ones are, they'd have to kill them. They'd have to completely remove them. And then, of all the things in Israel you're allowed or not allowed to do, one of the things you absolutely cannot do is dig up an olive tree without permission. Like, it is the most severe punishment that you could think of for digging up a tree. If you think your HOA is bad, just try to dig up an olive tree in Israel. Actually, if you even get an offshoot that grows off and it separates from its original one, you've got to get permission to move it from its spot to a new spot because it's protected there in Israel. From the Mount of Olives, we kind of walk down to past the spot of the Garden of Gethsemane and to this stack of stones. Does this stack of stones look different than our other stack of stones? Our large structure goes upwards. This stone stuff goes downward, right? That's because this is actually one of the pools. In the back left of this photo is the site where Jesus encountered a man who wanted to be well and was waiting for, in his words and the cultural understanding, the angel to come and disturb the waters. And he's like, I can't get there in time. I can't get there in time because the minute it gets stirred up, I can't move fast enough because I can't walk. And so this is the location there where this most likely would have occurred. Jesus and whoever this man was, the paralyzed individual, would have been to the left of our image on the screen. And so it kind of ties that history together. At the Israel Museum, this is really cool. Just kind of shows you what they think Israel looked like in the first century. It was a first century model. Let's pause here for a second. We're about halfway through our walking through Israel experience. Questions, things I went over really fast, things that you want to know a little bit more about. Raise your hand if I'm giving you way more information than you're mentally prepared for at this hour. I was like, I'm not sure about that. We'll see. All right. This is an actual real place. This is an Alabama store inside the old city of Jerusalem. The guy who owns it went to Alabama. Why did he open it there? Because he went to Alabama. And he realized as a tourist city, he could sell a lot of stuff to people from Alabama. Across the street, though, you can get your t-shirts from any university you'd like, any place you would like, and they'll make you one. I think Jesse's got one that I picked up there that he wears from time to time from a particular university in Tennessee that he likes. But they've got all there. But what's really cool isn't that place. It's something like this. There are 2 priestly amulets that are on display at the Israel Museum. These 2 amulets represent the oldest known copies of biblical text in human possession. They were designed to be worn. They were a priestly blessing. There is a translation of the small amulet that's placed right here. And it kind of has something might feel similar, like you get an amulet for one of your own family members for so-and-so. We're not quite sure what the name was. The son, daughter of, not quite sure who it was. May they, he or she, be blessed by Adonai or Yahweh, the warrior and rebuker of possibly evil. May Yahweh bless you and keep you. May Yahweh make his face shine upon you and grant you peace. Does that start from that kind of unfamiliar to super familiar? This is Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. That's what that is. So in Hebrew, this is what it looks like. I was going to pronounce it, but I love you all too much to do that to you. Plus, I was going to do this one more time. But basically, it is super close to that priestly amulet prayer. This is a piece that goes back to around 700-ish before the time of Christ. And so you have a piece of antiquity that has potential history that deep. That's really cool. Like, I don't know how else you can kind of think about it, but now you have textual existence well prior to the destruction of Israel, the division of the kingdoms, where the scriptures are in their community, and you can go see them. In that same museum, you can also find additional artifacts. This one's unique to our tour, but it's super cool. You often see a lot of textual action regarding folks having idols in their homes. Asherah is one of the common statements that they had this in their house. That's kind of what you have here. This is a household idol that was designed to go in the wall, recessed like those old phone spots. You used to have phones kind of recessed in the wall. That's what this was. In the photo here, taking a picture of it, is one of the team member archaeologists who helped recover it from that site. That's Luke Chandler in the photo. His father, Royce Chandler, was on that same dig. Luke was leading our tour. He's a Christian. His father's a Christian. They both, at different times, have taught for Florida College. And they dug that artifact out as part of their work, and now it's on display at a museum. That's super cool. I don't know if you want to think about it in regards to being a rock star in your sport. If you're an archaeologist and something you found is on display at the single most important museum for it, like, you really can't get cooler than that. But for us, it ties in all those times in the Old Testament where you see someone having idols in their house. Most of it looks like this. Looks like a little dugout where you would offer a sacrifice, maybe put some incense in there, maybe burn something in there and offer it to the god. This is the site known as Shiloh. You see it a couple times in the place of the Old Testament, particularly prior to the establishment of physical Israel's temple. This is where the specific site is where they think that the tabernacle stood for a very long time. They don't know for sure, but they see that this has all the evidence of being the case. Right space, right general location, right dimensions. A lot of examples from the pottery shards that surround it and the archaeological work that goes around it, as Shiloh served as the first capital of Israel, really in many ways, because it was the heart of religious Israel until worship moved from there to be centralized in Jerusalem. If you want a textual reference, this is where in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, Hannah prays for Samuel. And so even if it wasn't on this particular patch of dirt, she would have been praying within a mile of that spot to be considered in Shiloh. Questions here, because we're going to leave this Israel space and go off into Samaria for a second. But if you've seen something, you wanted more details, you got a comment, interject. Rich?
Are they still discovering writings and scrolls in various caves? Are they still discovering those and finding those, and then I guess, are they still spending time to read them?
Yes. The problem they have with the Qumran scrolls in particular is labor. You have to have someone who is skilled in Proto-Hebrew and 2nd century Hebrew, that same space of time. There's two different types of Hebrew lettering. And has the skills to work as an archaeologist and can do so in Israel. The number of people who exist who have those unique combination of skills that can do it there is super small. They do allow some of it to leave to go to Chicago at the Oriental Museum up in Chicago. Excellent museum that has a huge holdings of a lot of the stuff. They actually have a second site in Israel that holds some of their stuff there too. And so I know people who go do that same work in America that have those skills to do that. And really, if anyone wants to be an archaeologist, they take volunteers every year. So if you want to spend a week, 2 weeks, 6 weeks digging in Israel, absolutely you can. You basically only have to pay for your travel there and back and fund money. They will feed you and house you while you're digging. So if you want to go be an archaeologist, you absolutely can. They'll work with archaeologists to coordinate. But basically you're digging in dirt that's like maybe the size of this pulpit area for a week, inch by inch going down. All right. I know it sounds really exciting, right? I absolutely do it. This right here is in the Samaritan region. In particular, a couple Old Testament events and New Testament events take place here. This particular kind of look at things shows us one of their amphitheaters that most likely would have been a place where Philip would have preached. And so this spot is a most likely location for Philip preaching in the book of Acts. You see some of the remains of that space throughout all of that. But that then closes out some of our Samaritan space. I've got a couple quick pictures at the end. I got to speed up. I got 5 minutes. But maybe we'll just stop right here and come back at it a second time. Let's see where we are. I'm only halfway through. So we're going to pause. We'll just find another night, maybe the first Wednesday of next year, to cover the other half of this, because there's just no way. But I will do this. We're going to do two things tonight. Let's see. Thing number one is to show you all Samaritan food. Because some of you love food, right? So this is probably the best meal I had there.
No falafel?
No falafel. That's barbecue chicken and hummus and vegetables. And it was fantastic. So there's Samaritan food for you. Chicken, basically like pizza chicken, barbecue chicken. Michael, do you have a question?
So on your trip, did you have one thing that just was your absolute favorite thing you saw?
So the answer to that is yes. My favorite spot has still stayed to be the Sea of Galilee, and that's part of the second half. So that's like days 6 through 10. We'll get there in a couple days. It's actually like on the last day there. But really seeing the priestly amulets in the Israel Museum, there's nothing else that you can find anywhere in holdings of humanity that has the biblical text that old. That's it. That's the oldest recorded instances of Scripture that you can verify a date for. They predate some of the Davidic inscriptions because we don't know when those took place. Like it's a recognized, this is legitimately tying that text. And that's important because that ties sections of the Pentateuch, the law, to a history that prepares us for everything that follows afterwards. So it kind of gives you a bedrock moment to say, this biblical text, that sometimes people are like, hey, like it was made up, or it came out late, or it kind of pushes the scales back on that and says, no, your suppositions about the origin of the Bible aren't really fleshed out because the biblical text existed before you say people started fooling with it and messing with it. And so from a standpoint of a faith builder or a really amazing thing, it's actually that little tiny piece of silver. There's two of them, those two priestly amulets. And you can go online and see them as well. But to like literally be 6 inches away, that was pretty cool. And like that's just in the museum there. And there's a lot of other little stuff that would probably build up to that too. All right, so standard questions. Michael's asked me what I liked. From a standpoint of this, and we've surveyed this, and I guess I had high hopes of getting through all of this tonight. When you're thinking about reading through the history of the Bible, history can be really boring, right? So I have a question. What for you takes what would be boring and makes it exciting? Not if you're someone who already loves history and gets excited about going to a museum, but like what takes history and makes it really important for you? James?
Maps.
You like the maps?
I like maps. They help me visualize things.
Yeah. And maps make a big difference. They really kind of help us show stuff. Like this one. This is Jericho, which we'll look at later. And it really helps you kind of see all this stuff. A lot of these sites are small, but Jericho is a huge historical spot. And so a lot of stuff happens there. And maps are a big deal. What else? What else do you like or helps you see the Bible story a little bit better?
The pictures that you show.
You know, photos are really cool. Movies are better. I'll just absolutely say this. I've said it 1,000 times to different people. going there with all the risks and difficulties is absolutely impressively beneficial to your faith. It's not that you don't believe, it's that it gives you context for your belief. And this is my simple illustration of that. Have any of you been to Gettysburg before? You guys been to Gettysburg? How many graves are there? Have you ever counted them? Is it overwhelming?
Yeah.
Is that different from reading about the math and the massacre that took place at Gettysburg than going there? South of us, there's one of the prisons from the Confederate side where they house Union prisoners and others, Andersonville. You can read about how many people died in there in a book, but there's graves outside the prison. There's just tons of them, and there's unmarked graves because they don't know who. There's something about shifting from words on a page to a place where you can walk that adjusts the context of history. I believe in Gettysburg, it happened. And I believe that Andersonville happened. My understanding of those two things change by being present at the sites. Michael? You had your hand up earlier.
Just backing up a little bit,
Oh, yeah.
where you said, what do you like about history? Whether I was talking to Alan after he came back or you, I really like when one of y'all would show me something, go, this is the actual place, this is the actual thing, not the near or about. The
Yeah,
actual stuff is really cool.
Like, that's why the Sea of Galilee is so amazing, because the Sea of Galilee hasn't changed. It's still the Sea of Galilee, where everything else around it, you might be guessing, the Temple Mount location. That's the Temple Mount. It's absolutely Temple Mount. Shiloh is absolutely Shiloh. You go to Israel, and it's still absolutely Israel. And when we say near or like here or near there, we might be talking 100 yards, not necessarily miles, because they're just not quite sure. That's the clock that says the end time has been reached. And so unfortunately, my high hopes of getting all 10 days into one night have failed. I apologize for that, but we'll have to have a second session. Thanks, everybody. If you've got more questions, things that you want to see in our second pass-through of this, we'll make sure that it's ready and available for you at the next time.
When are you going to do the second part?
I'll talk to Michael about that, figure it out. It'll be soon.
Please don't make it next week.
It'll be soon. And even if you're not here, you can't be here, it'll be recorded and streamed.